They wanted gold. They got defiance. In Ouagadougou, a single declaration shattered months of whispers in Washington and Paris. $300 million worth of Burkina Faso's gold was supposed to be tied neatly to an IMF contract, wrapped in the ribbon of a so-called relief package, and sealed with a digital currency experiment designed far from African soil. The fine print looked like modernization. In truth, it was a noose. But Ibrahim Traoré did not bow. He did not beg. He tore up the script before the ink touched the page. With one sentence, he transformed what was framed as a financial transaction into what many now call an economic coup. The world has watched for decades as African wealth left silently in ships and contracts. But this moment was different. It was a hand raised against the tide, a refusal that could echo far beyond the borders of one landlocked nation. Stay with us. This is more than a headline. It is a turning point history will remember. Subscribe now and stand with the story. Because the question that remains is not whether Burkina Faso can resist. It is whether others will follow. In the early months of 2025, Ouagadougou became the stage for a declaration that shook more than the corridors of Burkina Faso's ministries. It rattled the vaulted ceilings of Washington's financial institutions and echoed through Parisian television studios. The International Monetary Fund had offered what it described as a stabilization package. $300 million in debt relief, dressed with promises of investor confidence and credit access. But beneath the surface lay a trap polished with decades of experience. The centerpiece of the proposal was a collateralization clause. Burkina Faso's gold reserves, worth $300 million, were to be pledged as security. Should the nation stumble on repayment, for reasons as uncontrollable as a global commodity shock or a sudden regional conflict, the IMF would hold the legal right to seize the gold outright. Not as a temporary measure, not as a negotiation, but as a permanent transfer recognized under international law. For a country whose economy relies on gold for nearly 1/5 of its gross domestic product, the loss would not have been technical. It would have been existential. Yet the gold clause was only the first snare. Hidden in the fine print was a second layer, the Phoenix dollar. Advertised as an innovative digital currency pegged to Burkina Faso's gold, it promised to protect against inflation and to attract investors. The glossy presentation paper spoke of blockchain, transparency, and modernization. But the governance framework told another story. Control of the Phoenix dollar would sit not in Ouagadougou, but in Western banks and think tanks. Burkina Faso's reserves would form the foundation of a currency it did not control, while its citizens remained locked out of the benefits. Every ounce mined in the future risked being chained to an external system, a digital colonial coin cloaked in 21st century language. This was the deal that crossed Traoré's desk. For Western officials, the expectation was simple: a handshake, a signature, perhaps a short speech about cooperation. But instead, the cameras captured something else entirely. With the Burkina Faso flag behind him, Ibrahim Traoré declared that his nation would not surrender its gold to the IMF. No matter what collateral was promised, no matter what glittering phrases about modernization were whispered. In that instant, he turned a financial negotiation into a statement of sovereignty. The reaction was instantaneous. In Washington, anonymous insiders leaked their frustration, warning journalists that Burkina Faso was jeopardizing its stability. In Paris, commentators darkly predicted isolation for any African leader reckless enough to defy the established system. The intended message was intimidation. But on the streets of Ouagadougou, the reception was altogether different. Crowds gathered within hours. They waved placards scrawled with phrases like, "Not our gold," and "Africa is not for sale." Chants rose from miners, farmers, and students alike. The message was instinctive, uncoached. People understood that what was at stake was more than metal. Gold was not just a number on IMF spreadsheets. It was the backbone of schools, hospitals, and the very possibility of future industry. To lose it would have been to lose control of tomorrow. The symbolism ran deeper still. For decades, African wealth had been negotiated in the corridors of Washington, Paris, and London. Leaders were reduced to signatures on documents drafted elsewhere. But Traoré flipped the script. He did not plead for better terms. He did not negotiate for gradual reform. He tore up the page and said no. For the first time in years, the fine print was dragged into the daylight, and then burned before the ink dried. For observers in the Sahel, this moment was not just about Burkina Faso. It was a signal, a spark that others could refuse. In Bamako, officials applauded openly, calling it a line drawn in the sand. In Niamey, leaders hinted at their own reviews of resource contracts. What began as one leader's rejection suddenly looked like a region's awakening. The IMF had wagered that $300 million would buy silence. Instead, it purchased defiance. And this leaves us with a pressing question. If one contract could be rejected so publicly, what else was hidden inside the package that made it so suffocating, so dangerous, that Traoré had to slam the brakes before it was too late? When Ibrahim Traoré stood before the cameras and called the IMF deal an economic coup, it was more than rhetoric. It was a rupture. For decades, the idea that international financial institutions could dictate terms to African nations had become so normalized that it felt inevitable. With a single phrase, Traoré named what millions had long suspected: that behind the spreadsheets and polite diplomatic smiles lay a strategy of control, not partnership. The drama unfolded in the capital, but its reverberations spread quickly. Within hours, news of the rejection and the phrase economic coup was carried on community radios and WhatsApp groups across the Sahel. In Ouagadougou, the atmosphere was electric. Crowds surged into the streets, chanting his name and hoisting signs that declared, "Not our gold, and Africa is not for sale." For them, this was not a technical dispute about clauses and collateral. It was a defense of dignity. In Mali, the government's state radio praised the move as a watershed, declaring that a line had been drawn in the sand. In Niger, leaders hinted that they were reviewing uranium contracts long shaped by Paris. Even in Nigeria, where oil revenues dominate the economy, officials suggested that the precedent could not be ignored. What stunned Western observers was the speed of this solidarity. They had expected isolation. Instead, they witnessed a chorus. Washington responded with unease disguised as analysis. On financial news networks, commentators dismissed the move as reckless populism, yet could not hide their concern. If one small nation can refuse, one analyst admitted, others might follow. Paris was less restrained. French commentators predicted harsh consequences, speaking of aid freezes and diplomatic cold shoulders. But the harder the warnings, the louder the cheers in Ouagadougou. The symbolism of the moment ignited something raw. For miners who had seen trucks of gold depart their villages with little in return, this was vindication. For students raised under austerity policies imposed by foreign lenders, this was resistance. For ordinary traders, it was a simple truth made visible. Their nation's wealth belonged first to them. The clash of narratives reached fever pitch. In Western capitals, officials framed Traoré as a dangerous populist, willing to sacrifice his people's future for ideology. In Sahelian towns and cities, he was hailed as a defender of sovereignty. Social media amplified the divide, with hashtags echoing across Africa declaring solidarity and defiance. The IMF's frustration, usually hidden behind closed doors, became a public spectacle. What gave the moment even greater force was Traoré's consistency. This was not an isolated act of defiance. Months earlier, his government had moved to nationalize 5 major gold mines, redirecting revenues into the state budget rather than foreign shareholders. Signing the IMF's contract would have reversed those steps. By rejecting it, he showed that nationalization was not a gesture, but a policy. It was continuity, not chaos. The high point of this drama was not only in the president's speech, but in the people's echo. Images of women waving baskets of grain, men holding picks and shovels, and children chanting slogans filled local media. It was as if the entire nation was declaring, "We are not commodities to be bartered." For Western audiences, accustomed to viewing African politics through the lens of fragility and dependency, the sight of jubilant crowds supporting outright rejection of the IMF was bewildering. For Africans watching from Bamako to Lagos, it was empowering. A wall had cracked, and through it streamed the possibility that economic sovereignty was no longer a dream but a decision. Yet with celebration came risk. Officials in Washington and Paris whispered about sanctions, withheld aid, and the dangers of financial isolation. Commentators asked whether Burkina Faso could survive without external capital inflows. Some predicted shortages, others unrest. The stakes had escalated. And so, as night fell on Ouagadougou, the question was no longer simply about one contract. It had become a struggle between two visions, one in which Africa remained bound by clauses drafted overseas, and another in which a small, landlocked nation dared to say no. But if the IMF could be defied so openly, and solidarity could spread so quickly, the question looming larger still was this: if one nation can resist, could an entire region follow? The rejection of the IMF's $300 million contract was not an abstract debate confined to government chambers. It filtered into the daily lives of citizens, shaping the way they viewed their future and the state that claimed to defend it. In the short term, the risks were real. Western analysts warned that Burkina Faso could lose access to international credit markets, that foreign investment might dry up, and that inflation could rise as external funding declined. They predicted a tightening noose around a fragile economy. But within Burkina Faso, the immediate effect was not fear. It was pride. Citizens felt, perhaps for the first time in a generation, that their leader had spoken with their voice rather than with borrowed words. This sense of dignity had foundations. Only months earlier, Traoré's government had nationalized 5 of the country's largest gold mines, placing them under the state-owned company Somabibi. Overnight, a fifth of Burkina Faso's gross domestic product, previously siphoned through foreign concessions, was redirected towards national priorities. Schools, hospitals, and infrastructure projects, long starved of funds, were promised a share of revenues once destined for shareholders overseas. The IMF contract would have reversed this trajectory, placing those same reserves back under foreign control. By rejecting it, Traoré demonstrated that sovereignty was not just rhetoric but policy. Politically, the impact was immediate. Opposition parties, often divided, found themselves struggling to criticize the move without alienating a population intoxicated with defiance. Even critics who questioned the economic risks were careful to frame their concerns in terms of implementation rather than principle. To denounce the rejection outright would have been to stand against the people's pride. The historical memory added weight. Generations of Burkinabe remembered the scars left by IMF programs. The austerity that stripped classrooms of teachers, the privatizations that sold public utilities to foreign buyers, the currency devaluations that doubled the price of food overnight. Families could recall the lean years when entire sectors of society seemed hollowed out by reforms that were never theirs to choose. Against that backdrop, the refusal of new conditionalities felt like an act of justice long delayed. This is where the phrase Ibrahim Traoré coup gains its resonance. Though no tanks rolled through the streets, the rejection was framed as a coup of a different kind. Not against a government, but against a financial order that had kept nations subservient. It was bloodless, but it was no less radical. For many, it was not simply about Burkina Faso. It was a signal that the chains of debt and conditionality could be broken without violence, that sovereignty could be asserted with a pen refusing to sign. Socially, the atmosphere shifted. Farmers in remote villages, who had long watched convoys of trucks hauling gold and cotton to ports without seeing the benefits, spoke of a tide turning. Teachers in underfunded schools told students that the country's wealth was finally being reclaimed. Traders in markets expressed relief that their gold would not vanish into foreign vaults. Whether or not the promises could be fulfilled in practice, the symbolic transformation was profound. People began to imagine a future where resources served citizens first, but hope carried its burdens. Could Burkina Faso sustain its economy without external credit lines? Could state management of gold mines deliver efficiency? Or would corruption corrode the vision? These were not minor questions, and even the most ardent supporters acknowledged the challenges. Yet the crucial difference lay in who was asking them. For the first time in decades, the debate was being framed by Burkinabe themselves, not by conditions imposed from abroad. The political order across the Sahel was shifting too. In Bamako and Niamey, leaders cited Burkina Faso as evidence that sovereignty could be defended openly. In regional forums, whispers began about coordinated approaches to resource contracts, about collective resistance to conditional loans. What was once unthinkable, public defiance of the IMF, was fast becoming a template. For Western capitals, this was deeply unsettling. The fear was not just about Burkina Faso, but about contagion. If one country could reject and its citizens could rally in support, then others might be emboldened. The domino effect threatened not only financial flows, but the architecture of influence itself. And so, within Burkina Faso, life after the rejection became a balancing act. Pride swelling in the streets, uncertainty simmering in the markets, and politics reshaped by a leader's gamble. The question that hung in the air was simple. Would the rejection stand as a symbol of sovereignty or collapse under the weight of isolation? But before an answer could emerge, the gaze shifted outward, toward the international stage, where allies and adversaries alike began to take their positions. The tremor that began in Ouagadougou did not stay confined within Burkina Faso's borders. It traveled swiftly across chancelleries and trading floors, drawing lines of tension between those who feared contagion and those who celebrated resistance. In Washington, the reaction was one of controlled alarm. Anonymous IMF insiders briefed journalists that Traoré's rejection was reckless, warning of destabilization and loss of investor confidence. On financial news networks, commentators framed the decision as a dangerous experiment that could isolate Burkina Faso from global markets. Yet even in their criticism, a note of unease surfaced. If one country could refuse such a package, what would prevent others? The question hung heavily, for it pointed to the fragility of a model long considered unshakable. Paris's response was sharper. French commentators warned that defying the IMF was tantamount to diplomatic suicide. They suggested aid freezes, reduced cooperation, and political isolation awaited Burkina Faso. For a nation that had only recently begun nationalizing its gold mines and reducing French influence, the tone from Paris carried the bitterness of a former power, watching its grip slip away. But the Sahel told a different story. In Bamako, Malian officials praised the rejection as a defining act of sovereignty. State radio declared that a line had been drawn, one that others could follow. In Niamey, Nigerian leaders, already wrestling with disputes over uranium contracts, hinted at the possibility of recalibrating their own resource policies. Across the region, WhatsApp groups, community radios, and Pan-African media reframed the event not as recklessness, but as a spark, a moment when silence turned into solidarity. Regional bodies walked a careful line. ECOWAS, often pressured by Western capitals, expressed concern about financial stability, but stopped short of outright condemnation. The African Union, meanwhile, called for dialogue and African-led solutions, a diplomatic nod to the rising tide of resource nationalism. Pan-African commentators were more forthright, hailing the rejection as a watershed in the struggle for economic sovereignty. For the United States, the implications extended beyond economics. Washington had long viewed the Sahel not only as a frontier for counterterrorism, but as a reservoir of resources critical to global supply chains. Gold, uranium, and oil were not mere commodities. They were levers of strategic influence. The fear was that if Burkina Faso's defiance inspired a Burkina Faso Revolution across the region, the architecture of Western leverage would weaken. The clash of perspectives revealed more than divergent interests. It exposed the fault lines between a global system reliant on African compliance and a rising regional doctrine that equated survival with sovereignty. To Western observers, the rejection threatened order. To African audiences, it promised liberation. And as these narratives collided on the international stage, one question grew unavoidable. If the world powers could not contain this defiance, what path lay ahead for Africa itself? The rejection of the IMF's contract was never just about $300 million. It was about the road ahead, a choice between dependence dressed as relief and sovereignty carved from struggle. In the aftermath of the decision, a new vision began to take shape, one not imposed from outside but articulated by Africans themselves. The first pillar of this vision is financial independence. Institutions such as Afreximbank and the African Development Bank are no longer peripheral players. They are becoming anchors, providing credit without demanding that gold or uranium be handed over as collateral. Emergency stabilization funds, pooled by African states, are slowly building a shield against the crises that once drove governments to Washington's doorstep. The IMF's claim to be the lender of last resort is being challenged by an African last resort built on African soil. The second pillar is intra-African trade. For too long, raw materials have left African ports cheaply only to return as expensive finished goods. The African Continental Free Trade Area offers a chance to break that cycle, lowering barriers between neighbors so that Burkina gold can feed Ghanaian refineries, Malian cotton can supply Nigerian factories, and Kenyan innovation can power South African markets. It is more than economics. It is the psychology of self-reliance. The third pillar is monetary autonomy. If the Phoenix dollar represented a digital leash, African leaders are exploring currencies of their own. Proposals for regional or even continental e-currencies are no longer dismissed as fantasy. Backed by Africa's reserves and governed through African institutions, such currencies could free trade from the dollar's chokehold and flip the colonial script of money itself. The fourth pillar is industrialization. Resource nationalism means little if oil, gold, and uranium remain exported raw. Across the continent, investments are being made in refining plants, processing facilities, and defense industries. Burkina Faso's expansion of gold refining capacity is one piece of this puzzle, joined by Nigeria's manufacturing drive and Mozambique's energy infrastructure projects. The idea is not isolation, but transformation, to multiply value at home before anything leaves. The fifth and perhaps most radical pillar is unity. The military-led governments of the Sahel, once dismissed as fragile, are now aligning policies on mining contracts and monetary reform. Instead of negotiating alone, they are speaking together. For the first time in modern history, sovereignty is being discussed not as a solitary gamble, but as a collective shield. This vision is neither simple nor risk-free. It requires discipline, cooperation, and trust across nations that have often competed rather than collaborated. Yet the rejection of one IMF contract has shown that alternatives are not only imaginable, but actionable. And so the seed has been planted. The question is whether it will grow into a harvest of sovereignty or whether external pressure will cut it down before it takes root. It began with a contract, $300 million, a clause, a digital coin. On paper, it looked like relief. In practice, it was a trap. By refusing to sign, Ibrahim Traoré did more than block a deal. He revealed the scaffolding of an entire system built on dependency, a system that for half a century had presented itself as inevitable. His defiance reframed the narrative. For decades, African leaders had been told there was no alternative to IMF programs. Traoré showed otherwise. The rejection was not reckless, as critics claimed. It was deliberate, a stand for sovereignty in a world that had long equated Africa's role with compliance. It was in every sense an Ibrahim Traoré coup against financial orthodoxy. The implications stretch far beyond Ouagadougou. If Burkina Faso can reject conditionality, what prevents Niger from pricing its uranium on its own terms? What stops Mali from keeping more of its gold revenues? What stops Nigeria from deciding that oil profits must serve its citizens first? This is the deeper resonance of what some have begun to call the Burkina Faso Revolution. It is not confined to one leader or one nation. It is the stirring of a continent reimagining its place in the global order. And yet the risks remain. The path of sovereignty is steep, and the forces arrayed against it are formidable. Sanctions, isolation, and diplomatic pressure will not disappear overnight. But history teaches us that once a chain is seen for what it is, its hold begins to weaken. The IMF's power was built not only on contracts but on silence. By calling it an economic coup, Traoré replaced silence with a rallying cry. So here lies the paradox. What began as a dispute over $300 million has become a contest over centuries of control. The question is no longer whether the IMF's model is flawed, but whether Africa can design something beyond it. Systems of finance, trade, and unity that serve its people first. Do you believe this moment marks the birth of a truly sovereign Africa? Share your thoughts below. Subscribe to join the journey because the story is not finished. It is only beginning. And as history writes its next chapter, one truth resounds. This is not just an Ibrahim Traoré coup. It may be the first dawn of an African century.